Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining, and welcome to this seminar or this webinar. This is convened by the Australian Data Science Network, and I'm Kerry Mangerson, so I'm Distinguished Professor of Statistics, and I'm Director of the Centre for Data Science, and I'm your moderator for today. So I'd like to first start with an acknowledgement to country. I'll begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations of the land where QUT now stands, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country also from where you're joining us today. So I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. So this webinar series that we've created here is really focused on the report released in October 2021 by the Australian Academy of Science on advancing data-intensive research in Australia. So this report was funded by the Australian Research Council under a Linkage Learned Academy special project, so a LASP scheme, and it was launched at the virtual eResearch Australasia conference. The authors of the report include Emeritus Professor Michael Barber as lead author, and Professor Jane Elith, who are both with us today, and also Danny Kingsley and Aisha Tulloch. So the report presents findings from consultations with the research community on the challenges and opportunities of data-intensive research in Australia. And when the report was released, it was stated to be essential reading for a wide range of researchers, their institutions, funding councils and agencies, publicly funded research agencies, professional societies, learned academies, policymakers, and organisations charged with maintaining and building Australia's e-research infrastructure. So it's really relevant for us to reflect on this document. A substantial component of the document and its recommendations focuses on the field of data science. And as members of the ADSN, the Australian Data Science Network, this has direct implications for our centres, our universities and organisations, and our profession. And so we've now then planned this series of webinars and seminars to discuss key aspects of the report and how we might respond individually and collectively. So in this first session of the series, we've invited two authors of the report, Professor Michael Barber and Professor Jane Elith, and we've asked them to give some background to the report and provide a high-level summary of the findings and recommendations and discuss the relevance of the report for the ADSN and its member entities, and also to talk about other activities in this space that are relevant for us to consider in this context. We had also invited Anna Maria Arabia, from the policy analyst from the Academy, to speak to the broader importance of the report and what the Science Academy would like to see with respect to feedback and impact. Now, Anna Maria is ill today, unfortunately, so she can't join us. So we'll then go, we've asked Michael to talk to some of the points that Anna Maria was going to make. Now, Michael may or may not put on a filter to actually look like Anna Maria while he's presenting Anna Maria's comments, but we can imagine what that will look like when he talks. So we're going to ask Jane and Michael, well, Michael and Jane in turn, to speak to the report and the associated activities for 10 minutes or so. And then we'll follow this with a group discussion. So if you as audience members have any questions, please put them in the chat, and time permitting, we can include these in the discussion. And also Michael and Jane, if you wish to respond to any of those questions as we go through, then please do so. So we'll start then with Michael, and Michael comes to us as one of the most eminent scientists in the country. He has over 25 years of senior executive roles in Australian universities and CSIRO. He's been a council member and Secretary of Science Policy at the Australian Academy of Science, and he continues to be an active contributor to Australia's science and innovation policy. And he currently chairs the Program Steering Committee for the Securing Australia's Future project of the Australian Council of Learned Academies. So I'll hand over to you, Michael, to talk about the report.
Thank you, Kerry. I won't correct your bio, but a few bits of that go back a long way in history. Probably Jane and I have actually decided, like good academics, to not necessarily follow the rules. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the report, and then I think Jane wants to talk about, and I think it's probably quite important to talk about the Aladdin project, which is a follow-up work the Academy is doing. Then I'll close off picking up a few of those issues, and all of that hopefully will get done in no more than 20 minutes. So there's plenty of time for discussion, because I think much of it will be more productive if we're reacting, even negatively reacting to people's specific questions. Thank you for the sort of comment, and I have to admit that I hope members around the table have taken our little encouragement and have read the report and haven't got to chapter 4 and thrown it in the bin immediately, because I think we do think it's an important report on a critical issue facing Australia's research system. I think the first comment I would like to make is people should read the report taking note of the title, because it is advancing data-intensive research. It actually started, if you read the beginning of the report, from a report that was called about big data and research, and we changed the title and, in fact, the focus for two reasons. One, because the steering committee, of which Kerry was a member, thought big data was a bit of a hackneyed phrase, which I agree with. And secondly, if you start to talk about, which in fact the National Science Foundation did probably a decade ago, if you start to talk about data, big data in research, you have to start talking about data in research. So it is focused on the research, it's focused on the research community, and it's focused on data-intensive research. Then, of course, the second finding, and I've tended in my later life to end up in things I know enough to be dangerous, but not a great deal about at times, it became pretty clear that the naive views that some of us had at the beginning of the project about what data-intensive research was, you know, cosmology, astronomy, geoscience, etc., that was rapidly going out the window. Not that those areas are not important areas of challenging data-intensive research, but data-intensive research was beginning to be researched much more broadly across the sciences. And Jane will make some comments about that when she talks about it. And of course, Jane herself was a very significant influence on our thinking, particularly mine, because coming from the biosciences and ecology, that was an emerging area of data-intensive research. So in a way, the question wasn't about data-intensive research, it was about the future of research in Australia. And it wasn't really even about science, because there are areas of research, some of which very close to areas in Queensland, work on Indigenous languages, for example, at UQ. Those are areas of research outside the sciences, which are being transformed by data-intensive research. So that's the first comment. That will mean, of course, there are a lot of important things that we don't talk about, and they could potentially, I don't think many of them do, but they could potentially change the aspect of the report. So the chapters, if you view it in that way, begin to frame the issues which data-intensive research faces on. Firstly, chapter 3, of course, about access to data, and Australia is completely off the page globally about good practice in that space. And it's time for the research community to put up. It is no longer, in my opinion, time for the research community to quibble about whether data is in fact somehow not released or should be released. So much depends upon having access to data for good reasons, and in fact for bad reasons, or for reasons to detect integrity, etc., which I'll talk about. Infrastructure is critical, and in fact, pleasingly, the roadmap refresh report had our report early, did seem to echo what we said, that we have a rather fragmented policy setting, and the next phase has to integrate compute, data, and skills, and the skills part will feed back into the network. Skills more broadly, we touch upon, and then, of course, as you pointed to, chapter 4. So we start with the assumption that data science is critical to data-intensive research. And then we began to ask ourselves questions, and in fact, a specific question that the ARC proposal did require us to answer was actually to give an assessment of the status of data science in Australia. And in fact, sobering for a field that depends upon data. It is almost impossible to assess data science research in Australia because it is almost invisible in the data metrics of Australia. Now, I'm someone who in my old age has become more and more disillusioned with metrics, and particularly metrics driving policy decisions in universities, but it's the world we live in. And so I think one of the questions that flowed out pretty automatically for us was it was time for data science to, if you like, grow up. It had to be seen, unfortunately, perhaps for some reasons, along the same metrics of Australia. So somehow it had to get into the data, into the research data statistics. It had to get into those frameworks which drive broad policy, which comes back to being assessed within ERA. It comes back to being assessed under the codes of research. We recognized the timing on the codes of research was going to be difficult because we'd just had a review which took on for a couple of years and we were probably 6 or 7 months too late. So we make some modest things. But that probably, from my discussion with some of your colleagues, is in some ways our most provocative discussion. But I think some of the arguments that go round here are worth serious consideration about whether they are particularly helpful anymore. Someone who's cited in the report described data science as the child of computer science and statistics. And if you want to keep that, you've got probably a few more parents, but that'll do. And there's another way from that means it's time for the child to grow up. Its genes will influence itself. And so I actually do think there is now an emergent discipline, and I'd probably remove the word emerging, but having it emerged, data science, which is an important discipline in its own right. It's certainly, as you all know, an important profession in its own right. It does take on board a combination of skills, most of which don't actually sit in any single person. But there are a lot of other disciplines for which that is true. Applied mathematics, my own discipline, is a particularly, I think, relevant one for you to reflect upon, because applied mathematicians should use the relevant mathematics to the problem. That does not mean that each applied mathematician needs to know all of mathematics, but he or she should know enough to know when to ask some questions. I think the other important part to me is the criticality that these new data analytic tools are making for research, and in fact, for the wider community. My real worry is that these are increasingly getting commoditized, and that will raise serious risks for science about the misuse of these tools, either inadvertently or perhaps advertently in some occasions. So reflecting on chapter 4 and various discussions I've had since the report, I don't actually would change any words we've actually said. I do think there is a powerful new discipline in this world where you position it within the plethora of the disciplines of science is an interesting academic discussion. And I don't think I could define it, and I don't think defining it is necessarily the right thing to do. But I do think there is a danger if it is too sweeping, that all of, sure, statistics gets information from data, but I think conventional statistics using experimental plots or significantly tests, etc. Yeah, that's data science in the broadest category, but sweeping that up then I think misses the point about the use of data analytic tools in diverse data sets, in complex data sets, in contexts in which, yes, uncertainty, etc., plays a role. But to me, the single biggest reason why I believe a more coherent data science, and that's why our recommendation about an Australian Data Science Society looking like, the Australian Maths Society, the Australian Physics Society, would be beneficial, because the real discussion, I think, needs to be between those whose background is a statistical data science side and those who've come to data science through computer science, machine learning, deep learning, etc. Because it's no point academically saying, oh, well, we can sort these bits and pieces out, flip it out and look at it outside. And I think that is a significant weakness for the field. While I'm still focused on data science and research, I think the other reason why I think that synergy is now critical for research is not only will it advance new research. Since last 18 months or so, I've been involved with the International Science Council's project on scientific publishing, and it is clear to me we are facing an increasing concern about integrity in publishing, and in fact, the whole mechanisms of publishing. If we're going to fix that, your skill sets, the new tools that are emerging from natural language processing, etc., which will help us potentially reduce risks for integrity, are going to need new tools that your skill sets are the ones that actually need to focus it. So it seems to me the time is right for the community to say, yes, there is such a thing called data science. Then there's a whole slew of questions which flow from that. What's the better organization? That's why I think your next seminar is a very interesting, important topic. And it also flows through to some critical questions about worries, which I understand about the contributing disciplines somehow getting run over by this massive new bus. Those are important issues, but you're not the first discipline to emerge facing those sorts of issues. I'm old enough to remember the emergence of computer science, and you could see many of the same sorts of discussions that went on around it. So I think what you've initiated here, Kerry and your colleagues, is a very, very important discussion. I think that's probably almost enough from me on a sort of generic level. Happy to take questions, but I think it'd then be useful for Jane to focus it a little bit on through the Aladdin work, and then I'll close off with a few comments from the Academy's perspective.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's an excellent summary and commentary on the report. I really appreciate the reflection as the lead author of the report. Okay, Jane. So Jane's an ecologist at heart, and I dare say a data scientist by nature. So we'll claim her. She's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and an international member of the National Academy of Sciences. She's highly decorated, and she was awarded the 2015 Prime Minister's Prize for Life Scientist of the Year and the 2016 Fenner Medal from the Australian Academy of Science. She's a Thomson Reuters highly cited researcher, placing her in the top 1% of scholars internationally. So has such great credentials to be talking to us today and to be an author on this report. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Kerry. I've put together a few slides, so you've got something new to look at. And let me just try and share those. Is that working?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me here. It's good to be part of your meeting, and I'd love to know who you all are. Sort of I know some of you, but yeah, it's been great to be part of this discussion. I'd also like to add my acknowledgement to the one already given and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land I've studied and worked for many years, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. So just for background, I'm now an honorary professor at Melbourne Uni, and as Kerry said, my interest in data science is really as a teacher and researcher in quantitative ecology. I've learned a few skills. I've worked with statisticians and computer scientists and data scientists, and several of our students now go out to data science jobs. And some of our projects have been with Indigenous knowledge too. So I've really seen firsthand the importance of skills in this area and the frustrations of having data scattered all over the place and wasting probably years, I'd say, in total, struggling with permissions and gathering data. And it sort of really impresses on me the urgency of getting things right so we can do good quality research and are ready to respond to emerging needs. So really that's motivating my involvement in this. So I'm going to be talking to you about Aladdin, which is the Australian Learned Academy's data interworking network. And so this is a 12-month project, and it's a partnership between the 5 learned academies, ACOLA and the ARDC. And I've noticed we've got some people from ARDC here. The 5 academies cover the humanities, health and medicine, science, social sciences and technology and engineering. And the main role of ACOLA, which is the Council of Learned Academies, is to coordinate the project and to draft the consolidated report. And today, I just want to talk very briefly about the Academy of Science's contribution to this project, because really I think I see it as a sort of a follow-up to the report Michael's been talking about. So the main job of this particular project is to gather information and to sift out key messages, essentially. And the aims really are to, first of all, understand data infrastructure, skills and policy that are required for high quality data-enabled research in Australia, to develop a cohesive data agenda across the academies, the 5 academies involved, and then to identify opportunities to align national research data policy and infrastructure planning with the strategic needs of the research domains that are represented through the academies. And so the way they're doing it is each of the 5 academies has conducted a sort of an environmental scan, so to speak, of research data needs and issues in their research domains. And that's going to be brought together in a joint report that will identify strategic research data needs and opportunities for leadership, for advocacy and planning in the data realm. And so, as I said, today I'll just talk about the Academy of Science's contribution, and most of this work's actually been done by Lauren Sullivan, who's a policy analyst with the Academy, and Lauren's here today. There's also a steering committee, and I'm chair of that, and on that is Ian Chubb, Andy Pittman, Leslie Wyborn, who I've seen here, Ginny Barber and Danny Kingsley, and also Anna Maria Arabia and Chris Anderson from the Academy staff. But Lauren is doing most of the work, and so we really thank her for that. So in the Academy, to gather information from scientists, the way we approached it was to run 3 workshops, and each of these has focused on one of the 3 types of research. So we sort of characterise those as discovery, which is sort of meaning targeted projects, understanding and prediction. And so then we invited different participants to each workshop, and at each workshop we had different people. And then we also had a chair, and Kerry, in fact, chaired one of the meetings. And so what we tried to do is cover the breadth of science-related disciplines and to choose participants that give us the best possible diversity across dimensions like institutions, gender, and career stages. So we had just about 12 to 15 participants in each workshop, and then we've consulted more widely in bringing together the report. And so here the aim was really to discuss data needs in the broadest sense, so infrastructure, assets, policies, skills and capabilities, and the gaps and weaknesses and risks that we see in the current system, and then opportunities going forward. And so we did that with surveys before the meeting and then guided discussions at each meeting. So our report's going to just summarise the results of the workshops under these 5 main headings, and then go on to propose actions and discuss opportunities for Academy involvement. And the report should be out in June this year, so I imagine you'll be able to get a copy if you're interested in reading it before your upcoming discussions. Now, so if you've had a look at the Academy, at the report that Michael's talked about already, you'll see that these topics really are basically echoing the main themes of the report that Michael's discussed. In fact, to me, it was quite clear from the discussions that the report that Michael's presented really does cover a number of the issues well. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about everything we're saying about these, but I thought I'd just make a few comments on it. So in terms of national coordination and data integration, it's not really surprising that we had a lot of discussion about the need for data integration and interoperability. So there was a lot of discussion about the value of centralised, nationally integrated research data repositories, and suggestions that these should be discipline specific, with specialist curation that's targeted to discipline needs. And so one analogy was sort of thinking about it like a Bureau of Meteorology for other things, like for biodiversity or for health. And one of the main points made is that these really need sustained resourcing that can bring data sets together and provide expertise for curation and management and data analysis. And on the second topic of data sharing, it's clear that the current attitude to data sharing varies quite a lot across disciplines within science, as does the capability to do it properly. And we discussed a lot of nuances, including sharing data between government, industry and research, and impediments for data sharing. Amongst all the participants, there was a really widespread agreement that data are a public good, even though other people may not always see it like that. And there was lots of discussion around incentives, whether they be a carrot or a stick for data sharing. So things like mandating data sharing agreements in funded research. So that's one of the sticks, and one of the carrots being recognition of data sharing and open software in measures of academic success. So on the fourth topic, the data skills and expertise, the discussion was really quite wide-ranging, but it really emphasised the need for at least familiarity with data issues for all researchers, not just data scientists. And we sort of felt that really requires targeted training for non-specialists. And then we also discussed the need for good academic pathways for data scientists. And then one of the interesting comments on the fifth topic was from the lawyer in my session, who felt that the ethics approvals processes that are currently in place are much too cumbersome because people often have to apply for permissions from several different organisations for the same permissions from those organisations, but for the same project. And this person was the very strong opinion that it doesn't at all strengthen the ethical treatment of data, but it really ends up being an administrative burden. And so they were very keen to see much more streamlined processes so that time can be spent on the real ethical issues. And here again, we had a very strong agreement on the need to adopt fair and care principles that came out in Michael's report. So I thought I'd just end with a very few specific comments from the workshops that sort of struck me and stayed with me, and I thought it might perhaps spark some discussion today. So there was a very strong feeling, Ed, that we know enough. The issues are really clear. And in fact, one of the participants said that as interesting as the discussion had been, they felt like they'd heard it all before. And so the core really was, we just have to actually do something. We need to make compelling cases. We need to get someone on board in a position of influence at the national level to get something done. So this was actually said in the context of health, where the participants were describing a really clear vision for a national centre for biomedical data, and that would include mechanisms for feeding back information to clinicians in real time. They've had that vision for quite some time. They've discussed it at length. They've written about it, but the strong opinion was we actually just have to do something. Sort of talking about how to find someone high up in the Department of Health that needs to take leadership at the national level to get it going. So the protagonists of this idea were really sort of saying, we need to be finding allies and we need to lobby them to get decisions made, to get these national centres actually happening. And so more generally, there was a lot of agreement that we really need to be able to make clear value propositions for these sorts of national data centres that would allow funding to be allocated. So I thought that was interesting. One of the participants were missing the glue. They said their own personal measure of research efficiency was a time span between when they had a good research idea and when they got a result. They said they had access to data, they had computing facilities, they had domain experts, but the missing gap was a glue, the pool of people with skills in handling data and analysing it, so between the computer and the domain experts. And they were really bemoaning the fact that this hampers their research project, and they wanted more people and better career paths for them, so they had ongoing access to these gluey people who are essential really to their research outputs. And then the astrophysicists, over a couple of workshops, told us repeatedly that they've been doing this for a long time. You know, they've been training students in handling large quantities of data. They've been training students in analysis and in data science, and they've been lobbying for money and for ways to deal with massive data streams. And so they told us that the key to their progress on getting funding for grand challenges was to speak with one voice. And so while there might be differences in you know, between individuals in the background in their discipline, they told us the only way to succeed in getting money for big things like the square kilometre array was to work together. So they sort of said they spent a lot of time working on social and cultural issues within their discipline until they could work together and be less competitive. And so perhaps that's actually a good note to end on, the last of our anecdotes. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. That's you know, I think when we think of the report and we think of the extensions of the report and the learnings of the report, then that's really useful to see how that's leading into the Aladdin project and further as well. And I really like the sort of the comments at the end. There's you know, a bit of take-home messages. I'm going to turn back to Michael now to give a précis of what Anna Maria was going to talk about from the perspective of the Academy.
Well, if I can allow one comment on Jane, it is amazing, Jane. I think we heard all of those messages, and I think I can even begin to put a face to some of them. To me, your first one, it is time to do something. And I would put that more or less in the research community's hands. It's easy for me to say from my point in my own career, but if we don't change, if we don't solve some of these problems ourselves in ways that might make some of us uncomfortable, I think it's a big wish to hope that it's somehow going to be imposed from outside. So the Aladdin project, I think, is really important in distilling down the broader messages that we brought. Also, I think it's important to appreciate that the pandemic delayed us by at least 18 months or 2 years. So a lot of our consultation went back to 2019, early 2020. And so it was a period in which I worried that a lot of what we concluded had in fact been overtaken. So what I've heard from the Aladdin project, I think is quite important. And of course, the thing, it goes well beyond that. Okay, let me just, because I really do want to hear what people have to say and then ask more specific questions. Anna Maria points to the Aladdin project as an important building block of what we go forward. At the moment, of course, we're in a little bit of uncertainty. Come 2 weeks' time, we may get clear who the science minister is. And I would actually say the science minister of the next government will be an important person to actually influence. The chief scientist is someone else. Unfortunately, Kathy is not yet quite carried as much emphasis in this as Alan Finkel was doing. And I think that's an important person to start to influence on how this will actually put together. And the report does put some things into the chief scientist's lap because there's really nowhere else to put it. The immediate issues, which I think Anna Maria points to correctly, are firstly, and if you haven't, you should actually read the report from the Zucharski Committee looking at the roadmap refresh. And while it makes no references, it does parrot much of what we actually said about the integrated e-research infrastructure. And again, as we said, it emphasizes what I used to say when I was chair of the National Computational Infrastructure. The important part is what I call a triple helix: the compute, the data, and then the skills that bring that data together. So that's the skills there are broader than just data science, although if you adopt the definition that we perhaps trialed softly in our report, which is to reflect it back to the life science, data life science or cycle of WING, you see the need to curate, you see the need to analyze, etc., through that framework, and that skill set really needs to be in part of it. The roadmap refresh talks about a digital research strategy. And so again, that's an important influence. The big worry, of course, we have been this route many, many years before. We've had strategies, we've had plans, we've had digital economies, we've had digital X, Ys, and Zs. So again, I think we just need to find a time to do it. We've already touched on the Inter-Academies partnership. The other important point Anna Maria makes is the Academy is also a conduit to the International Science Council, and in particular to CODATA, which is the subcommittee of the International Science Council. And I think it is very, very important that Australia does not think we are so special. In fact, talking to a colleague of mine on CODATA, he said, well, you know, really, we've solved all the problems. You just need to pick up our report and implement them. And that's probably 90 or 80% true. And my worry, again, and we say this in the report, there are areas of data-intensive research for which other parts of the world are well advanced of us, of the frameworks, the policies, etc. So to think about doing it because we're Australian and we're somehow unique, I think is a risk that we've always tended to play. And so the work through the Academy to work with CODATA, to work with the National Committee for Data and Science, which is one of the national committees, that will be important. But what the Aladdin Project's important bit was about, it flowed down to start to ask the questions of the disciplines. And so the Academy has taken the report and will put it into all the national committees and ask the decadal plans, of which there are the products of the national committees, that they do need to look at data science, data issues, data infrastructure within the context of the disciplines. And we had a little very nice prototype of that probably now 2-3 years ago with food and nutrition, because that's an area where you don't necessarily think of it being data intensive, yet it brings to the table, particularly with the advent of wearables and new sorts of data collection items, a whole range of new data sources, which then change research, leading to, in fact, the emergence of personalized nutrition. And since someone pointed out that the average nutrition does not feed any person properly, is an interesting sense on where new fields are coming to it. So each of the disciplines need to look at it. The risk there is we'll end up with problems of interoperability. And so again, as Jane commented upon, it's important, and it's important that this group actually looks at that, because as we tried to argue, if you develop a data science community which brings in all of the people that do work relevant to data science, we can hope to miss the main problems. In fact, one of the really interesting examples that came up in the report, and maybe in the report, I can't remember, but we had some discussion about the fact that surgeons need to get material-specific data, yet it's almost impossible for surgeons to actually access data on materials in a way that flows back to understand questions of implants in various ways that go into the human body. So interoperability really does need to be broadly across the sciences, and it's a critical issue. And so I think we have to begin to define and impose, which always challenges scientists, impose some standards of behavior. So this flows back into the real issues, which the final point the Academy is interested in. The Academy is concerned about integrity. It's concerned about the fact that our research system probably does need to be strengthened to some stage. So working within those frameworks, this is a very important group on a particular critical issue. And I certainly don't want to find in 10 years' time that these reports have created some impact when they hit the table and done nothing beyond that. So Kerry, I think it's time to shut up and let people ask more specific questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. That's great. I'm just going to remind people, I'm sure everybody's read and memorised the report, but I'm going to remind them of the recommendations before we start the questions and discussions. Also, what we will do is I will open the floor after these recommendations, and I'm going to start with David because he's put David Lovell, who's put a comment in the chat. But if any people want to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and then we'll refer to you, and you can make the comment. Okay, so the recommendations in the report are to revise employment statistics so that they recognise data scientists and other professionals explicitly, and ensure that data scientists working in multidisciplinary areas are accurately represented. The second one is to, as data science as a discipline. So it should be recognised as a discipline and a field of research in its own right. The third one is around data science centres, which is why we're here as well, and to strengthen the coordination between data science centres with direct infrastructure support for the Australian Data Science Network. The fourth recommendation is around data science society, and this is to establish a data science society with an inclusive membership. The fifth one is data science field of research code. So it's recognised as part of the 4 codes. And the sixth one is around mapping Australia's data science capability, so we can seek funding to map this capability, analogous to the recent report on Australia's climate science capability. The seventh of the 8 recommendations is to strengthen Australia's research in foundational data science. And this is through an Australian program, perhaps such as the Research in Principles of Data Science program, a dedicated call for a centre in data science, and the foundational data science fields of research, so that challenges beyond the capacity of existing data science. So the 8th report is around, the 8th recommendation is around gender imbalance in data science. And so to implement the Women in STEM Decadal Plan to actively address the gender imbalance in data science. So they're the 8 recommendations. And as we see, many of those are directly, or all of them are directly relevant to us as professionals in the area, and to our different centres and universities, and also many of them to our ADSN community. So on that note then, I'm going to open the floor, and as I said, David's had enough notice now, so we're going to ask David to comment. David, you made 2 comments in the chat. Would you like to speak to one of them?
Yeah, look, I'm really grateful to Michael and Jane for giving us an overview. The thing that really struck me about, one of the things that really struck me about the report was data science as an enabling discipline. You know, and the reason data science is such an enabling discipline is that data on their own don't carry meaning. We have to attach meaning to data, which means that data science has to be part of collaborations with other areas which know about the meaning of data, and we have fruitful collaborations there. So I'm curious to know the extent to which discussions in developing the report were about data science being part of a tightly coupled collaboration with other disciplines, and data science as being something where it's looking at methods and approaches in its own right. Kerry referred to this as foundational data science. So to Jane and Michael, your thoughts on that balance between the enabling power of data science and foundational data science, which is more abstract and methodological. What would you say?
In fact, if I had my way, of those recommendations that I would like to see implemented, first and foremost, it would be the recommendation which Kerry wrote out about foundational data science. I say that for 2 reasons. One is, and it's a bit of an abstract one, but it's been supported particularly by various people around the place. The nature of data today is challenging the technologies and methods that we actually have at their heart, whether that's just because we're chewing up so much compute power doing machine learning tools that we just have to change those algorithms in ways. It would be a pity if Australians Australian research and innovation was not able to capture some of the developments that will actually come from that new world of data intensity, which we've never seen before. Toby Walsh at New South Wales points out that, in fact, the square kilometre array will generate almost daily as much data as often chucked around the place by Google. Yeah, more structured perhaps than Google, but that will change new tools. And one of the reasons that a lot of the big data firms are sniffing around the square kilometre array, because they recognise that. So it seems to me the part of that question is that the community developing its own research agenda within a broad spectrum. And as we point out, capturing some of the ways of capturing data, of putting on metatags, automating those tools, understanding the limits of the tools are, I think, very, very important parts of the activity of this particular group. Understanding why machine learning tools work as well as they should. Some of the papers in that field are fascinating combinations of applied mathematicians, computer scientists, statisticians. So yeah, I do think there is a call that does not actually in any way devalue the data science's critical collaborative framework that actually does need to work with the custodians, if you like, of the data of the disciplines, because that will shape the way back. But my worry at the moment is that too much of the effort in the data science community, if you'd allow me to be a little sharp, blunt, is on the exchange, committed transfer of data. And it doesn't apply just to data science. The government's AI centres worry about this thing. Too much on the transfer, not enough, if you like, on the deep sorts of transformational research. And the US recognized that with the NSF program that we actually cite. So I think you're right. It's these two things that are in fact the characteristics. And in fact, assessing data scientists, that would be appropriate to ask those two particular questions. The only cautionary note I put, David, is on perhaps your opening statement, because yes, it is about understanding and getting information from data. But I think statistics does that in a traditional sense of the word. And I do find it, I think, important to perhaps differentiate that away, because one's focusing at complex issues and complex data, big data, etc., and particularly automated tools. So there's just a sense of focus in that scope. But yeah, it's a long-winded answer from me, sorry.
Thanks very much, Michael. Jane, would you like to comment?
I don't think I've got a lot to add. I mean, I agree entirely that the two streams are significant. I would have thought like the data scientists as enablers brings up all the questions about what does your career path look like if you're at a university? How do you structure universities so that it works really well? How do you keep staff on so that we've got dedicated staff and that can work with domain specialists? I think the enablers bring up all those questions, but I agree entirely that without foundational research and without you sort of lack the ability then to do excellent work developing new things, and it would be a shame to miss that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions that have been posed, and these are some comments and questions from Scott and also Joanna Batstone, so Scott Sisson and Joanna Batstone, about how this report's actually feeding into other reports. And so Scott talks about the PMC consultations. Joanna also talks about the way that this report's feeding into government consultations, and how we might then be able to have an impact through this report into those discussions. So again, Jane, would you like to comment on that?
I was actually wondering if Lauren would like to say something about that too, if she's still here.
Sure. And before you speak, Lauren, I'll just throw to Joanna and Scott if you'd like to just elaborate a little on any of the statements that you've made in the chat, recognising time.
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, so my question was very much around moving forwards in terms of consultation. Clearly, as Scott pointed out, and I actually had missed this, so thank you, Scott, that there is this PM&C consultation going on. Given that the Academy has put all of this great work together in generating this report, I just wasn't clear on the intersection of how do we push some of those recommendations into the Australian government's national agenda, and whether that was already programmatically set up, or whether we should be, as universities and stakeholders, putting in our submissions that reflect the recommendations coming out of these reports.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. And Scott, would you like to elaborate on your comments?
Yeah, I mean, not much else to add really, but you know, the PM&C approach is really sort of top down, whereas, you know, we're sort of talking Aladdin going into the national committees, which is a sort of a more bottom up. You know, which is more likely to work, perhaps. So I just wondered about the intersection between these two.
Okay, thanks. Now throw to Lauren.
Thank you. I'm sorry if there's a bit of echo in the background. I'm just at uni today. But I think so, addressing Scott's question first, that's sort of in the chat. So Aladdin will be complete in time to feed into both the data strategy and the National Research Infrastructure digital strategy, that part of things. So the Academy makes submissions to things like the Australian Data Strategy, and we are planning on doing a submission that's informed by the Aladdin report and the Advancing Data Intensive Research report. The other way we kind of engage would be directly engaging with departments. So for example, the Department of Education for National Research Infrastructure, we'd be looking at progressing discussions with them directly. But yeah, as you say, there are sort of two ways. There's, yeah, that top-down approach going to government to communicate what we need. And also there's a big part for the community to play. So as Michael touched on, through things like the decadal plans that are developed by the national committees. I think, Joanna, that partly answers your question, but then I think you also made a comment about the best way for, I guess, other organisations to contribute. I think it is valuable for other organisations to make their own submissions, and if you think it's appropriate to reinforce the messages of our reports, then that's great. And I think it's valuable for government to hear messages reinforced from multiple avenues. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I'd only add two bits to that. One was just to strongly echo your comment that if it is possible to be consistent, to broadly sing from the hymn sheet, if you allow that thing. I think the other thing for people to look at is to look internationally and just look at what's actually happening in your discipline or your broader discipline internationally. And I think there's a tendency often to focus that on the United States or Europe. And I would probably drop the view that it's well worth looking at Canada, because Canada is of a scale that looks like Australia. It has a federal system like Australia. It has one big difference from Australia, namely universities are funded from the provinces. But that aside, I think we do need to occasionally suggest that the solution is available and it is worth doing it. So it's worth often to keep in mind, particularly if we have a new government, but even if we don't have a new government, we're going to have a financially constrained government. It would be very wise to try and focus our proposals in ones that says to a minister, you might get some kudos from doing this. The answer is take this from overseas and adapt it at the margins rather than spending the next 10 years designing Australia's own activity. So I think your message is a sound to, but I think I finally come back to a view that I'm strongly convinced about, and that is, I think, a stronger voice for the data scientists, recognizing their special place, if you like, but without being too embracive, I think would be a very strong development for where we potentially need to go in integrating together the data sciences and in convincing our colleagues that freeing up data, that making Chapter 3 mandatory, because without the data access, we won't get the benefits. And so I think it's within us to do some homework as well to make it all possible.
I was thinking too that one other thing I would think is, it's just interesting when we get together and try and do reports like this, that often, you know, I know everyone is really busy. And if you're asked to give comment on things, I think, you know, I know myself in my professional life, it's just so easy to be overwhelmed and to not have time. But it really does help enormously when someone takes the time to read a draft and to make comments on it. So another role, I think, is just saying, I'm happy to look at drafts and give commentary, because, you know, no one of us holds, you know, the full picture. You know, none of us are experts in this, or certainly I'm not. And hearing different viewpoints will just enable a better whole, I think. Yeah. So just that whole, if you're asked, it's just fabulous if you can do it, if you can make time.
Oh, thanks very much, Jane, and thanks, Lauren. That was excellent as a summary. Okay, so we are running out of time, and so I'm going to just talk about where to from here. And so we hope to keep these sessions going over the next few months, and we've got a tentative list of topics that we want to cover based on the report. So the role of data science research centres and the ADSN in the National Data Science Agenda that comes out of recommendation 4.3. Data science as a discipline and how we think about that, and how our core disciplines play into that concept. That's recommendation 4.2. We have data science education in Australia, and education in the broader sense also, as in terms of upskilling, and also engagement with the ARDC. So that's recommendation 4.3 again, and where to from here. And so we'd like to focus on these topics. Jane and Michael, in 10 seconds, do you have any comments on that? Do you think that this is reasonable topics to focus on? And would a report back to you be a reasonable way to convey our discussions? Jane?
Yeah, I think they're all interesting topics. And I think the one thing that I really thought about when I thought about data science education is just, please think about all of us who actually aren't data scientists, but are your domain experts, because I just sort of think the whole thing about how do you actually reach out training to people who don't want to learn the ins and outs of Python, but do want to understand data, and they want to enable all their students to be excellent at this thing. You know, how do you reach out to you know, all the fringes?
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Michael, 10 seconds.
All I can say is that I think the topics you want to explore are important. My worry will be that they'll go round and round in circles, if you don't mind me saying so. So I think you should take cognizance of the first comment that Jane had, just do something. That said, I think working out how you influence the recognition of data scientists on their own terms within universities, and the transparency of that is critical. I one stage did plot a number of data science centers in university and found one famous university that had something like 6 data points where you could come into it. So the current fragmentation, if I may use that slightly provocative word, I don't think helps data science in any particular way, but that runs across a whole lot of organizational structures and things like that. So being open in the discussion, but focused on trying to find a conclusion that works, and maybe the one that works at QUT is not the one that works at Tasmania, but at least if there's some interoperability between those models, that would be, in fact, a very useful thing. And again, my final message, please look overseas. Please keep your eye on what's happening overseas.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So this brings us to the end of the session. This is an Australian Data Science Network activity. So please, for the people who are in the ADSN, if you have some comments about these sessions and what we should be focusing on and how we should conduct them, and anything about them, then please get in touch, because this is our activity. So the next session in the series will focus on the role of research centres in furthering Australia's data science strategy. And our panellists will include Joanna Batstone, Scott Sisson, both directors of research centres in data science, and Kerry Wilson, who's DVC here at QUT and past director of major institutes and research centres. And so, as you can see on the screen there, this will be held on Friday, June the 10th. So thank you very much to our panellists, Michael and Jane, for your time and your comments. Thanks very much also to Tim McCougar for his help in organising this series. And finally, thanks to you, our audience, and from the ADSN, take care and bye for now.